So while they're doing that, just a quick introduction. I am primarily a multiple sclerosis researcher. And about 15 years back, a patient was referred to my clinic with an unusual set of neurological type symptoms. Initially thought that she had a neurological disorder, but after very careful investigation, they couldn't find the lesion. And it turned out that she had a very unusual manifestation of stress. Used to be called hysteria, we now call it conversion disorder. Thank you. And this was a patient who made a full recovery from her condition, and she turned out to be a very well-known war journalist. And I said to her at the time, you know, you knew you were becoming unwell with your symptoms. Why did you not reach out for help earlier? Why did it have to get to this stage where you ended up in an emergency room? And she said to me, you don't understand this profession of journalism. She said, if you let on that you're psychologically weak, they'll never send you to do this kind of work. And she loved doing it. And so she kept it to herself, and in the process became very unwell. So I'm going to speak about journalists because this woman's clinical history intrigued me. And when I started to do this work 15 years back, journalists were regarded as generally impartial observers. Certainly when they went into war zones were very dangerous and they could get injured or killed, but they weren't being deliberately targeted. If you fast forward to today's world, ISIS now puts a bounty of $100,000 on a journalist. Journalists have become the target. They're in the crosshairs of insurgents. And in the process, as you'll see, their profession has become increasingly more dangerous. So some quick aims to my talk: to understand the stressors that journalists now face, and to understand how these might translate into psychological distress. And my funding sources have been the CNN, BBC, UNESCO, the Dart Foundation, and the Freedom Forum in Washington, D.C. So this comes from a cartoon from USA Today, just showing you how war has become increasingly dangerous for journalists. And you can see the First World War, only 2 journalists were killed in a war that led to millions of casualties. If you look at the current conflict in Iraq, over 200 journalists have been killed. So you can see by just following the sequence down here, it's becoming increasingly dangerous. When I started to do this work 15 years back, the part that surprised me was that a Medline search failed to reveal a single publication on the question of journalists, war, and trauma. I mean, there's a huge trauma literature, as you know, on veterans, policemen, victims of rape, assault, motor vehicle accidents, but there wasn't a single publication on journalists. So to understand the profession, I started to read. And we have here Evelyn Waugh's satirical account of a journalist in Abyssinia, Scoop. We have Graham Greene's account of a journalist in Vietnam under French occupation. There's the Bang Bang Club, the account of 4 photojournalists who covered the first multiracial election in South Africa. By the time they finished their coverage, 2 of the journalists were dead, 2 of the 4 were dead. We have the great Robert Capper's biography, Martin Bell, who covered the Balkans and became a member of Parliament in the United Kingdom. So this was my reading. Back in 2000, the 2 big conflicts that dominated the press were the Civil War, the prolonged Civil War in Yugoslavia, and the genocide in Rwanda. So I started to read personal memoirs of journalists in relation to these conflicts, and you can see them over here: Yugoslavia, and the Rwandan genocide. Hollywood, of course, got in on the action. We have here the Nick Nolte film of a journalist, a war journalist in, I forget the country, I think Indonesia it was. And here we have Nick Nolte in Nicaragua playing the role of a war journalist. But perhaps this was my favorite reading because it came to me from my kids. I mean, Tintin is a quintessential war reporter. You know, he gets beaten up, he gets kidnapped, he gets knocked out, but he keeps on coming back for more. So the question was this: why had nothing been written about this profession? And I think part of the answer can be found in the title to this biography of Martha Gellhorn. Now, Gellhorn is known as one of Hemingway's wives, something that she resented bitterly towards the end of her life. She was a great, great war journalist. In fact, Martha Gellhorn was raped, but she never spoke about it. It's buried somewhere in her biography. And the title over here, Nothing Ever Happens to the Brave, is a very appealing title for a book, but it's misleading. Very bad things happen to brave people. Brave people can be very badly hurt. And this really applies to journalists. The profession seemed to have invested itself in this aura of some kind of impunity, that one could swan into conflict and emerge psychologically fine. And for the most part, they do, but they're not immune from the effects of trauma. So the very first study that I undertook, funded by the Freedom Forum in Washington, D.C., involved two groups of journalists. One group of war journalists who came from BBC, CNN, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, etc. 170 names were given to me by management, of whom 140 agreed to take part. So it had an over 80% response rate, which is very unusual for this kind of social science work. Had a control group of journalists who had never been to conflict. They were domestic reporters, and I had to control for the stress of journalism, meeting the scoop, the deadlines, etc. The only difference between these two groups was that one had defined their career by conflict and a war. I collected demographic data, the conflicts, they covered the alcohol and drug use, the psychological data, which I'll explain, etc. I looked at post-traumatic stress disorder, which is going to be familiar to you, using the impact of event scale. I looked at symptoms of depression with the Beck Depression Inventory. Looked at overall psychological distress with the General Health Questionnaire, and then we actually could quantify exposure to trauma through a rating scale developed by Bonnie Green in Washington, in which you can actually get the individual to look back retrospectively over their life and add up the number of times that they've been exposed to stressful life events. These were the conflicts covered by the journalists in the initial study. Remember, this is going back to the year 2000, and you can see over here that the war work was dominated by Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, and Kosovo, the prolonged civil war in the Balkans. But you can also see down here that there are many African conflicts as well. And Afghanistan down here refers to Afghanistan under the Soviets, not the current conflict in Afghanistan. This is a very difficult group to study because they're always on the move. You can't phone them, you can't send fax, and so we developed a website in which they could complete the data. And you have to badger them because, they're always on the go. And so someone sent me this cartoon basically poking fun at me, saying it's that shrink from Toronto again, asking if you've completed these questionnaires. But this is what you had to do to collect the data. So here is the data, and you can see the war group over here, the control group over here, a very nice demographic match between the two. It's predominantly a young person's profession. Once again, predominantly male, and this is changing now. The only difference between these two groups was the marital status, that the journalists who go off to war are more likely to be single or divorced. And in many ways, that makes intuitive sense because they're just not at home. This kind of existence is not helpful to relationships. They spend on average 6 to 9 months away from home. But the part that I was pleased to see was this. This was a very experienced group of journalists. They'd been reporting war for an average 15 years. So a prolonged exposure to very dangerous things. Here we can see their PTSD profile, just summarized for you, the 3 cardinal symptom blocks, although it's changed with the DSM-5, but we have the re-experiencing trauma, the avoidance symptomatology, the arousal, total PTSD scores on the impact of event scale, and no surprise that the journalists who go off to war have a lot more symptoms than the journalists who stay at home. And when it comes to major depression, you see exactly the same thing. They have a lot more symptoms of depression than the journalists who stay at home. When you come into alcohol, and we divide this according to gender because there are different limits for men and women, you can see that the war journalists drink more, whether they're male or female. And in fact, their mean alcohol content intake over a week exceeds what the Canadian Medical Association recommends for healthy drinking. Now, when I present my data to journalists, they listen very respectfully when I talk about PTSD and depression, but when I speak about alcohol, they say to me, I don't really understand the world at all. They think that 14 units of alcohol per week, as defined by the Canadian Medical Association, is ridiculous. It should be quite a lot higher than that. So I kind of put up this cartoon to deflect some of the irritability that comes my way when I talk to them about this question. But there is no doubt that journalists, those who are distressed, use alcohol to self-medicate their distress. They might use it as a hypnotic. They can't fall asleep at night. They use alcohol for that. But this was the one statistic that the news organizations found very interesting, which was that despite some journalists having more PTSD and depression type symptoms and drinking to excess, they were not more likely to receive help. So their psychological distress was going undetected and untreated. Well, after the study, I went back to my life as a multiple sclerosis researcher, and then 9/11 took place. And because we had published this one study in the American Journal of Psychiatry, suddenly you become the overnight expert. And In response to the events of 9/11, I received a request from CNN to go down to New York to look at the journalists in New York who were dealing with the cataclysm that had visited them. And this was not an abstract threat to these journalists. Remember, these were journalists who were not war journalists. They were domestic journalists. They wanted to stay at home. And suddenly 9/11 happens a few blocks away from their bureau. The old CNN bureau was very close to downtown, the World Trade Center. And you can see that on the day of the attack, 19 journalists were actually at the World Trade Center when the buildings came down. 17 were in the newsroom and 10 were out on the streets of New York City. Some of the journalists knew individuals who had been killed, a friend or a colleague. And they knew some of the injured as well. So the first thing that I did with this group was I gave them a simple analog scale and said, how well do you think you're doing in response to the events surrounding you? And the majority of journalists are doing just fine. They always are. There's a very resilient group of individuals. But there's always a subgroup who will develop distress. And they mark it very clearly on this analog scale over here, where they said they were doing very poorly. And I collected this data within 3 months of 9/11. So now a unique research opportunity presented itself. I had on the one hand a group of domestic journalists post 9/11 who had never been to conflict, this group here. I had my domestic group from my previous study, pre-9/11, never been to conflict. And here I've got the war journalists. And I brought together 3 groups, 45, 46 journalists in each group. You can see that they're demographically very well matched. And then I had a look at their PTSD profiles. And you can see over here that the war journalists and the domestic journalists post 9/11 have a very similar level of symptomatology in relation to PTSD, much higher than the domestic journalists pre-9/11. But there's good news to this, because I followed this group longitudinally over time, and there was no fresh threat in New York. And with the passage of time, this line over here, the brown bar, came all the way down to where you see the mauve bar over here. So what I was tapping into was distress following 9/11. There's a resilience to these individuals. In the absence of further threat, their scores improved. The one bar that never moves is the green bar, because these are the war journalists who go back repeatedly to war zones. So we did the second study, and then once again the telephone started ringing because the world is a troubled place. And the question asked of me when the war started in Iraq in 2003 was this. Journalists were now working with the military. They were embedded. And the news organizations didn't know whether embedded journalists were a good thing or not. If you're attached to the cavalry, is it helpful, or might it predispose you towards emotional distress? So we did a study. Data came from CNN and ITN. Once again, a very good response rate from 100 journalists. And now we said to the journalists, remember, this is when the first few months of the war starting in Iraq. Looking back over your careers, how many times have you been exposed to life-threatening events? We have here a group of embedded journalists, they're the ones who are working with the military, and we have a group of unilateral journalists, completely independent from the military. And you can see that on average, they've been exposed to a similar threshold of life-threatening events, remarkably high, more than 20. I mean, if you think of your own personal life, how many times do we confront a life-threatening stressor? This is a group that more than 20 times has been exposed to this. And then when we said, well, let's have a look at your early days in Iraq, within the first few months of the war, how many times have you been exposed to a life-threatening stressor then? And the average was 3, with a range of 0 to 10. Absolutely no difference, whether you were with the military or whether you were not. And so when you looked at the psychological responses, we've got here the embedded journalists attached to the military, and we have the unilateral journalists in mauve. It didn't really matter in terms of PTSD, depression, or psychological distress. Their scores were virtually identical because their exposure to trauma was the same in the early part of the war. Well, what about after we completed the study? Because the situation in Iraq changed fundamentally. So this was explained to me by Dexter Filkins, who was at the time working for the New York Times. He now writes for the New Yorker. And he said that back when the war started in Iraq in 2003, there was an enormous number of foreign correspondents in the country. And then the situation started to become more dangerous for journalists. There was the Ramadan offensive in late 2003, the rising of the Mahdi's army, the Fallujah offensive, and with each subsequent threat, more and more journalists left the country. So that by late 2004, there were very few correspondents working in Iraq simply because it was just too dangerous. They had become targets. And so you really couldn't do the kind of study that we had done 18 months before because there were not enough journalists left, which means that you now have to go into narrative history to find out what's going on. So I want to just present a case history very briefly too. This is an Italian journalist called Giuliana Screna, who worked for a communist, or works for a communist newspaper in Italy. She's a confirmed pacifist. She had been to Iraq on 7 separate visits to report on the plight of civilians in war zones. And this is what happened to her. It's okay, I think I'm good.
Italian journalist Giuliana Screna was well known for her coverage of the civilian casualties of the war in Iraq. She was interviewing refugees from Fallujah when she was kidnapped.
I said to my kidnappers, you know, we were there for people of Fallujah, just to let know what happened to the people of Fallujah, because up to now we have only the embedded journalists following the attack to Fallujah. And you kidnapped me. You are not interested in letting know what is happening in Fallujah, but they told me this is war.
As journalists, we are used to professional hazards, such as roadside bombs and getting caught in a crossfire. But you just don't want to imagine yourself at the mercy of a fundamentalist zealot who thinks killing you is his ticket to paradise.
So that's what's happened to her. And then there was a sequel to this.
When Italian journalist Giuliana Screna was released after 4 weeks held hostage, her colleagues in Rome celebrated. But then shocking news arrived. The car taking her to freedom came under sudden attack by American soldiers. The Italian intelligence agent who had negotiated her release was shot while trying to protect Giuliana.
I had no chance to have this sensation of happiness for my freedom. And this is very hard for me because the death of Calipari and the fact that a man that was the man that it was the one that got my freedom, that liberated me from my kidnappers.
Celebration over Giuliana's release turned into a vigil for the slain intelligence officer.
When I realized that it was heavy and he was dying on my body, it's terrible. It's something that I could never forget.
So we went to Rome to interview her as part of a documentary. And she'd been injured in this attack, and the surgeons had done a wonderful job putting her shoulder together. But she was deeply traumatized. This was a woman who couldn't sleep with the lights off. She wouldn't cross the road because she feared something bad would happen to her. She wouldn't open her mail because she felt that it had been tampered with. And she couldn't work as a journalist, she just couldn't write. And so I said to her, and I think this echoes the theme that came from General Dallaire's talk this morning, I said to her, why had you not received help for this? I mean, she very clearly had full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder. And she said, well, you know, the doctor said to me, just wait, these things get better by themselves. It will just go away. But we were visiting her many months after this, and it was not going away. It was getting worse. Her life was crippled not by her physical injury, but by her psychological injury. So I presented data thus far on journalists who fly to foreign countries, Canadian journalists, American journalists, British journalists to report on war, but then they come home. They might spend on average 6 weeks in a war zone, they come back for a break, then they go back. They have the luxury of being able to leave the zone of conflict. The question is, what about journalists who cannot do that? What about journalists who are trapped in very dangerous situations because that's where they live? And Mexico provides an example of that. So this was a study funded by UNESCO, and the concern was this: the drug wars are so toxic in that country, and the journalists are taking so much heat from the cartels. What does this mean for their psychological well-being? 3 hours away from Toronto by plane, you fly into this wonderful country that has a very dark underbelly, which is the drug violence. So I'm going to summarize a lot of data very quickly for you. But the threat posed by the drug lords is substantial. And just to reiterate the point, what differentiates Mexico from the previous countries that we've studied is that the Mexican journalists live there. They can't leave it. This is their society that's under threat. So we looked at a group of 104 journalists. We did the study in Spanish. Once again, we collected the data through a website, a very good response rate. And this is a summary of the data. The cartels have learned that if you threaten the journalists' families, you will silence the journalist. And this is what they do. They go after their parents, their children, their wives, their mother-in-laws, their in-laws, and this is a way that you get to the journalists. And the moment they start doing that, you see that things like the re-experiencing phenomena, the avoidance phenomena, the arousal symptoms of PTSD become significant. You see more depression. You see more social dysfunction. And paradoxically, the journalists who are reporting the drug wars in their distress are more likely to start using hard drugs to self-medicate their distress. This is a very worrying statistic that we found. 25% of the Mexican journalists whom we studied have stopped working on a particular system because they're too traumatized to carry on. And we feel that our data set, although it's small for a very large country, is representative of journalists working in the Badlands of Mexico. And the journalists who have stopped working have a lot more re-experiencing, avoidance, and arousal symptoms of PTSD. They have a lot more depression. Once again, social dysfunction features prominently. So this is a group of individuals who are being traumatized by their work with drugs. The final data set that I want to share with you comes from a new phenomenon in journalism called user-generated content. And this is a study that arose out of concerns that news organizations now have about journalists who spend their entire day in a room in Atlanta, where CNN is based, or London, where the BBC is, looking at material that has been filmed by the man on the street who pulls out his cell phone, films an atrocity, sends it into a newsroom in real time. And this has become a major source of news gathering. And the question asked was, what is this doing to journalists who look at this material all day long? When ISIS has a decapitation and they film it, this is scrutinized by journalists far from the scene. And this is what they're doing hour after hour. So they call this citizen journalism, user-generated content, and the question is, how does this affect individuals psychologically? There's a precedent for this. Go back 50 years. You recognize the president. This is JFK. He's on the streets of Dallas. In those days, you could get a lot closer to the president. Security wasn't what it is today. Someone could pull out their Kodak and take a picture of the president at close range. You see this over here. This is a picture taken of Kennedy the day of his assassination by a man in the street. And here we have this absolutely remarkable photograph taken by a woman called Mary Moorman, who pulled out her Kodak camera and captured the very moment in which Kennedy's head was struck by the assassin's bullet. And you can see his hair flies up. And Mary Moorman, interviewed many years afterwards, was looking through her viewfinder, and she recalled that as she saw the president's hair flip up like this is when she pushed her shutter, but she thought a gust of wind had done it. She had no knowledge that that was when the assassin's bullet struck the president. Even more remarkably, the entire assassination was captured by a man called Abraham Zapruder on his little camera. And so you had all this information on a historically very important event captured by the man in the street. And of course, the FBI and the CIA got hold of all this material. Mary Moorman, the woman who took the photograph of Kennedy's assassination, was given the photograph back after the FBI had finished with it. And she kept it in her drawer for 50 years. She didn't know what to do with this photograph. But it was there as this ever-present reminder of a ghastly event that she'd witnessed. Fast forward 50 years, we've now got technology that allows the man in the street to pull out his cell phone and capture these events in real time and send them to news organizations. So there's a fortune of data over here. I'm just going to summarize it on one slide for you. We collected all the usual PTSD, depression, and psychological distress data, and we looked at predictors of symptoms. What can predict symptomatology in these journalists who are sitting in the newsrooms looking at this material day in and day out? And I want you to focus on frequency of viewing traumatic images and duration of exposure to traumatic images. What we found was the most powerful predictor of distress in this group was the frequency with which they view these images. With respect to the general health questionnaire, the back depression inventory, intrusion, arousal, avoidance subscales of PTSD, if you go back day in and day out for short, sharp bursts, and you're looking at this relentless flow of images, for some journalists it undermines their emotional health. Now, the other side of the coin is this. This is not the same as going to war zones. There's no personal threat doing this. But the material that's coming in now is so deeply distressing that it's having a negative effect on some journalists' psychological well-being. How am I doing for time? Right. So I've got the evil eye, and I need to wrap up. My apologies. The final point that I want to make is this. I've studied a group of individuals who are not trained to deal with conflict. They're journalists. They don't go to military academy. They go to university. The photojournalists don't even go to university. They just go working in war zones. They're not schooled in violence like soldiers or policemen or even fire attendants. And yet their exposure to violence is intense. Soldiers do not have 15 years of constant exposure to warfare. Journalists have that. In fact, many of the journalists have told me, those currently working in Afghanistan, that their experience of warfare exceeds what it does with soldiers who are there to protect them, because they've just done it for such a long time. And for the most part, this is a resilient group. I mean, I've spoken about trauma. For the most part, journalists do not develop PTSD, they don't develop depression, but there's a significant minority who do, and they need to be detected and helped. On that note, I think I will finish. Thank you.